Thanks, Abby, and thanks to the Graduate Association for having me here. Just checking the microphone. So I'm just going to kind of go over some of the work that I've been at for the last 4 or 5 years or so. A big sort of swath through it here. Maybe. Why is it not advancing now? Do I have to use this? What did I point it at, though? I did that.
There you go.
Oh,
yeah, don't.
Now I'm back.
Yep, there you go. It's working now.
This works too now.
Perfect.
Somehow. So I'll just start with the kind of the big picture. The latest estimate that I heard is that there's about 1,350 species of bats worldwide, and like most patterns of biodiversity, the diversity is highest in the tropical and equatorial regions, and it's generally believed that this is where bats evolved, in a place where they had abundant and stable prey, and then they've kind of radiated north and south from there. And as they've radiated into some of these temperate areas, they are faced with a much different situation with the prey, where it was much more variable over time. So they've had to come up with strategies for dealing with seasonal prey shortages in some of the more temperate areas. So the two primary overwintering strategies that bats use are hibernation, where they find thermally stable, generally cool, humid environments where they could take advantage of prolonged bouts of torpor and basically wait out the insect populations. And the other is migration. So the thought is that bats move to areas with generally warm winters where their prey is at least occasionally active, so they can continue feeding throughout the entire winter. So to kind of translate this conceptual model onto the annual cycle of bats, generally bats are having their pups and raising them during the time when the insect abundances are highest. And then as the population of insects tend to start waning later in the season, they'll make some seasonal movements, which I have here in quotes as migration, and they make seasonal movements to their overwintering areas, which I have in here as hibernation sites. So there's, in the last decade or so, it's become clear that there's some really important and pressing reasons to understand the overwintering strategies of bats. Two of them, the first is white nose syndrome, which is a fungal disease that began radiating out of the northeast United States and has been decimating bat populations in its path. So this is a fungus that generally is impacting the hibernating bats. The other thing is that wind energy development can also kill large numbers of bats, and in particular it kills migrating bats during the time of migration. So I've chosen to focus my efforts primarily into migratory bats. Part of that was really a choice of convenience, in that the area that I work in Northwest California, we have 14 species of bats. For most of these species, we have no clue at all what they do. Are they really migratory, or how do they overwinter? But we do know that we have 3 migratory species. The silver-haired bat, the western red bat, and the hoary bat. I want to say something more about that. So I said that we have some migrating species of bats, but how do we even know that bats migrate at all? So over the past century or so, naturalists have observed bats here and there and basically inferred that they must be migrating. But it wasn't really until 2003 that the records were all kind of compiled in one place, so we could start to make sense of some of the patterns that we saw from museum records. So this is a little animation from a paper by my colleague Paul Cryan put together that shows how the distribution of museum records of bats over the course of the year. So you can look wherever you want. I'll look at Arizona, so no records in February, a couple females in March. Then we see sort of a mix starting in April. And as we move into the summer months in Arizona and kind of throughout the Rockies, it becomes really dominated by males during the summer months. And then as we get into September, we see much more mixing in the southern latitudes between males and females, and then very few records throughout the United States during the middle of winter. So there's a few things about this. One is there's obviously a lot of bias associated with this. This happened to be where biologists went out and were lucky enough to encounter the bats. The other thing to remember is that this is all the museum records. So this is hundreds of records over hundreds of years. So whether this reflects the contemporary seasonal distribution of these bats or not is really a big unknown. And probably the most important thing to remember is that this was the state of knowledge of migration by some of these tree roosting bats as of 13 years ago. So we're really at the infancy of trying to understand bat migration. So one of the other things that's happened over the past, say, 2 decades or so is the use of echolocation detectors, or commonly known as bat detectors, that sense the echolocations of bats when they pass by. And this has allowed us to deal with one of those biases, which is that you can't be there all the time and happen to either capture or shoot a bat or something like that. These detectors can be configured to set out for weeks or months or even throughout the whole year and take out that bias. So we're there sampling every single night. And I've been doing quite a bit of this in my neck of the woods for various reasons over the course of the year. Here's a few examples. And the kind of the basic data that we get looks something like this. So the dates within the year on the x-axis and the number of recordings that we got for that particular species is on the y-axis. There's some red marks in there, and this is a inevitable part of having technology in the field, is that occasionally these detectors fail. But that aside, we can see that for this particular resident species, the activity levels for it actually peaked in the fall period, but that this species was fairly active in our area throughout the entire year. So we can contrast that to the silver-haired bat, a migratory species, and here we see big peaks of activity in the fall, a smaller peak of activity in the spring, but very little activity at all during the summer or winter. So this kind of gives us an idea that this is a bat that could be passing through our area, particularly if we just look at this one data set. And that pattern is fairly similar to another migratory species, the hoary bat, which had big peaks of activity in the fall and the spring, but really not much activity, particularly in the summer, and very little in the winter. I'm enjoying your dry climate. So, of course, once we have more than one of these detectors, we can also start to make comparisons between sites. So, in this case, I'm comparing 2 sites. They're only about 100 kilometers apart, and for a single species, this migratory hoary bat, both of them show a peak of activity in the fall, and this is primarily when I do my field work. But at this site that's actually right on the coast at the beach, there's a significant amount of activity for this particular species throughout the year. So that's kind of an interesting finding. I'm not making too much of that right now, but just to show that there is differences in the seasonal occurrences of these site to site, and in this case over a pretty small geographic difference. So I realized that if I like to compare data sets among different sites, that, and there's numbers, dozens or maybe hundreds of people out there doing similar stuff, setting up these long-term detectors, that if we could combine all these data into one place, we might be able to make some sense of bat migration at some of the larger spatial scales. So by working with the Conservation Biology Institute, we have created the Bat Acoustic Monitoring Portal, which we refer to as BATAMP. And this allows users to upload data sets like the ones I just demonstrated to you, so that we can compile those data in one place and then visualize patterns in those data. So I'm just going to lead you through a few examples of the visualizations that we've done up to now. So this is one of the first ones I had. So each of these little black dots on here is the location of a detector that's operating. And then as we detect, in this case, hoary bats, those dots become orange and grow larger. And then this is a great video of me using my computer. So it shows that we're talking about the 10th or the 7th of October, 2013. And then on the 9th of October, we see hoary bats show up along the Columbia River Gorge and stay there for several nights. We see detections of hoary bats there. Then on the 14th, we start to see them showing up in Northwest California, and kind of continue down. They're in both places for a few days. And then several days later, we see the hoary bats arrive in Southern California. And if we play this out again over the following days, we see a similar pattern where they show up in the Columbia River Gorge, and then they show up in Northern and Southern California several days later. So I'm not trying to suggest that there was a flock of bats that was migrating from the Columbia River Gorge to northwestern California and then down to Southern California, but I think you can understand how, if we have larger data sets, we might really be able to explore how bats move on the landscape. Okay, so then this is basically, what did I just do? Nothing. So this is going to kind of explore that same scenario, but we'll switch it so we can look at some of the habitat that they're using along the way. So we can zoom in using this tool on the Columbia River Gorge, and we can see that the bat activity there was in this sort of riverine agricultural area, which fits very well from what folks know about hoary bats, the type of habitat they use. Zoom in on my primary study area, which is an old-growth redwood forest here in Northwest California. See, that's where they were during October. And then finally, we could zoom in on Southern California and see that this final detection was actually on the edge of the Mojave Desert at a wind energy facility where I was working in. So that's a bit unusual in that this is a tree roosting bat, and so finding it, there's a number of different habitats that it uses along its migratory route, all interesting information that might want to be considered in conservation decisions. So this is an even better example. So now there's been other users that have input their data. We got an amazing data series from the folks in Montana. So I'm going to illustrate a similar example using their data from 2014. So we start out in April, and we can see that there's a number of stations across Montana, not much hoary bat activity. That's not surprising. But we do see the occasional blip of activity, of hoary bat activity, starting there in early April. As we fast forward into May, we start to see an influx of hoary bats into the eastern part of the state, particularly in the southeastern portion. Then I'll fast forward to mid-June. Now we see hoary bats spread throughout the entire state of Montana, but really the high levels of activity are still in the eastern half of the state. And now into July, where there's high levels of activity, they're throughout the state, but more often we're starting to see high levels of activity in the northern Rocky Mountains. And then finally, we're going to go into September. So in September, we see many less detections of hoary bats there, but where we do see them, we're not seeing any indication that there's high levels of activity of bats on the eastern half of the state. They're mainly actually focused in the west. So this tool is really allowing us to develop some hypotheses about how bats might move, in this case in the state of Montana. So perhaps they're moving in from the southeast in the spring, but leaving via directly south or something in the fall. So the important thing is that this represents thousands of detections of hoary bats from across, just within the state of Montana and just within a single year. So it's a great advance over looking at hundreds of museum records over a 100-year period in terms of what we can learn about the movement patterns of these bats. And just to take this back to the wind energy issue for a second, there's been a number of efforts out there to try to characterize the risk of migratory bats on the landscape in relation to the wind energy development potential. So these efforts have relied again on primarily on the museum records, and they've also assumed that the habitat associations were static. In other words, if there wasn't a tree, you probably wouldn't find a hoary bat there. So I think you can see the potential of compiling all these acoustic data in one place and how we have a much richer and more nuanced data set with which to populate some of these large-scale models. But of course, the bat detectors can't do anything. Can't tell us everything. They're great because they can be out there every night, and we can't always be out there every night. But if we want to know something about the number of individuals at a particular site, what's the sex ratio of these individuals, are they reproducing in that year, we actually need to get our hands on the bat. And with forest bats, we do that by catching them in mist nets. And this is something that I've been up to in Northwest California for quite some time now for a variety of reasons. We'd be out capturing bats. I started in the sort of mountainous inland forests of Northwest California, and maybe passively, considering some of the patterns I saw in the data. One of the main ones that jumped out was the silverhair bats are probably the most frequently captured species in these inland forests in California. But only about 4% of those captures were females, and when we did capture females, it was after about the 20th of August. And this kind of fits well with some of the conceptual models that are out there for many species of bats in the western U.S. and in other parts of the world, wherein there's a a sexual segregation, particularly during summer when this is when most biologists are out looking for bats. So the female bats are looking for a place to raise their pups. So they're looking for a place with a stable prey population, nice warm areas. They can't really afford to use torpor very often because they need to remain alert and be nursing their pups. And in addition to that, if it is a cool spell or something, they have the ability to cluster together to save warmth. Males, on the other hand, are basically trying to get fat and wait for the females to finish having their babies. So they can use a completely different lifestyle. They can go out and forage every night, but then spend nearly every day in torpor. So the cooler place that they can find, the more energy they can save. So they tend to be dispersed and in higher elevation sites. And despite the fact that there really aren't prey available in the winter, it's become known over the past maybe decade or so that some bats are active in the winter. I found this out from going to the North American Symposium on Bat Research and seeing amazing presentations from my colleagues capturing bats in mist nets over frozen creeks in Alberta, Canada. So I thought, if they can do it in Canada, I should try this in Northwest California. So I'd get whatever, when I was first starting out, I could get whatever friends and family members I could to come out, bundle up, and see if we could capture some bats to answer to the basic question of what species of bats might be active in the winter in our area. And indeed, we can capture bats during the winter. So I don't expect you to know or even see what some of these species are here, but the species in the blue and green are in the genus Myotis. There's they make up about 80% of our captures during the summer. They're small bats that we assume are basically resident bats. In the winter, we capture many fewer bats and many fewer species, but immediately it was clear that we are capturing predominantly silver-haired bats. But we were out throughout the redwoods looking for bats at all times of year, and if we just look at our summer results, we can see that our results from the coast were really quite similar to what we'd found in the mountains inland, in that the majority of bats that we capture are males. So I decided that maybe we could flip this conceptual model on its side a little bit. So if you know anything about Northwest California, one of the prominent weather features is the thick fog belt that develops right along the coast, and it gives way pretty rapidly to some hot inland valleys. So what I'm proposing is that the females are inland in low elevation areas raising their pups, and the males are on the coast taking advantage of these cool temperatures to save energy throughout the summer. So if we look at our results from throughout the whole year, it turns out that in our area we can actually catch more silver-haired bats during the winter months than we can during the summer months. And not only that, the sex ratios are much closer to even sex ratios, so equal numbers of males and females in these areas. So then I kind of trying to come up with a conceptual model for migration in these bats. So the males are occupying the coastal areas, the females are inland, and then during autumn, we know that they're moving to the coast. So perhaps this is because of the more stable temperatures we have, perhaps it's because of higher humidity, it's not clear. One of the things that is clear is that bats do mate during the fall season, so some of these males, if they're hanging around throughout the year, might be ready to intercept the females when they come over to the coastal areas. So we answered the first question about what species were there. The second question: do females migrate here? Not here, but to Northwest California. Yes, it's clear simply from our capture results that they're migrating there from somewhere else. But it only leads to other questions, of course. Where exactly do the females spend their summers? That was a conceptual model. I don't actually know that they're spending it in inland California. And what about these males? Is it the same individuals that are there year-round, just kind of acting like resident species, even though they're known as a migratory species? Or is this sort of a steady stream of different individuals that are kind of constantly moving through our area? So to get at these questions, we kind of took a page out of the bird migration book to use stable isotope analysis. So I'll just give you a brief primer, is that these are some maps of hydrogen isotopes as in precipitation as it changes across the latitudes and longitudes of the continent. So the idea is that there's a certain isotopic concentration and precipitation that becomes incorporated into the groundwater. The plants live on that water and incorporate that isotope ratio. The insects feed on the plants, the bats feed on the insects, and that isotopic ratio is reflected in bats, in this case in the fur of bats, which we assume is grown on their summering grounds. So we thought that if we capture some bats during the fall, we can look at their isotope ratio and get some idea of where they spent the summer. But we were kind of aware going into this that some of those results are going to be pretty coarse. We might not actually be able to pin them down to a particular location. But what we did think is we did have a couple of competing hypotheses. The first was that the range of values that we'd see in females would be much greater than what we saw in males, because we knew that the females were coming from somewhere else, and some of the males could be resident. The alternative hypothesis was that males and females, the range in their values would be pretty equal, which was to indicate that there was a sort of stream of males always passing through our area that could have come from a number of different summering areas. So the hydrogen isotope is the one that's most frequently used to look at latitudinal migration. In our first batch of samples, we had many fewer samples from females, but basically not a really strong indication that there was a difference between males and females in terms of that range of values. So we start to think, well, maybe this does support the fact that there's a steady stream of males passing through the area. I wanted to break it down by summer to see if we could tease anything out of it there. Here the males and females are mixed, and it might sort of look like winter's a little lower and have a wider range, but actually there's about a 50 per mil range in each of these seasons. In the summer, which should have the narrowest range, if there's resident species there, is actually just as wide as the winter. And because this was composed almost entirely of males, we're starting to get the picture that really there doesn't seem to be, based on the isotope ratios, a resident population of males. So as I said, going into it, we knew that there was some levels of coarsity associated with this type of analysis. So we decided to have an outgroup. For the outgroup, we used the Yuma myotis. This is basically it's your typical bat that's active primarily during the summer. It's inactive during the winter. The sex ratios are equal. And probably the most important thing is that it's a really tiny bat that we don't presume moves very far at all. So we can call this our resident species and compare the isotope ratios that we find in this species to the migratory species. But when we did, we find that the range of values in this resident species, where we kind of know where it is all summer, are just as wide as what we found for the silver-haired bats, the migratory species. So rather than conclude we've discovered migration in a new species of bats, I think the more parsimonious explanation is that this technique needs a little refinement in order for us to be able to get the information that we need. So we've tried a few different things to increase our precision. We combined the hydrogen isotope with a number of other different isotopes. Here I'm just illustrating how we use sulfur isotope to see if we could tease out patterns there, so to increase the precision from where these bats were coming from. We also added samples from different parts throughout the country to see if we could make some sense of the pattern. And it's helpful, but it's really not the silver bullet for us so far. Another thing that's been tried, Jeff Clerk was a master's student in biology at Humboldt State, and he used a very similar construct, thinking that the fatty acids that were incorporated into a bat would differ between a resident and migratory animals. And again, we see a picture which is a little bit suggestive of something, but not a very clear pattern. So what we're trying to do now is combine some of this fatty acid signature analysis with the isotopes from these exact same individuals to see if we can sort of symbiotically improve our resolution there. And finally, in the face of a technique that isn't working as well as you thought, there's always the traditional I need more samples approach. So our original isotope work was conducted with data from 2008 to 2010. So in 2011, I was really committed to getting out earlier in the fall to see when these bats arrive and being out as often as we could in the winter. And as luck would have it, we actually spent a lot of effort, and we only captured 3 silver-haired bats during that winter, and all of them were males. So that's just the way it goes sometimes. But there was a positive outcome of that, because it was in that same fall of 2011 that we discovered that we could catch large numbers of hoary bats in the redwoods that are represented in the orange here. And it's to the point now where this is actually a regular pattern. People ask me, well, what do you know about bats? And the thing I'll tell them is really the only thing I know is that if it's the first week of October and you come to Humboldt Redwood State Park, we will catch a lot of these bats. And I think that's even notable to most bat biologists, in that the fact that we can capture lots of bats. So this is a table that represents roughly 70-year time periods, and the total number of records that we have for the hoary bat over that period. So less than 250 records, combined museum specimens and captures in some of these states. So hoary bats are generally known as one of the most difficult species to capture by bats. So even though they have this wide distribution, they're not often captured, and most biologists are very excited to capture them. That's because they don't work where I work, where just in this single fall we actually captured 154 of these individuals, and that's pretty much kind of par for the last few years too. So we've really hit on something here. I think part of the reason for that is that most work by biologists has been done during the summer, and even in this site that we know is a hot spot, we can't find these bats very often in the summer. We do most of our work in the fall, and during that period of time we get a median of about 6 hoary bats per survey. Sometimes we get 20 or even 30 individuals in a single night. And the other thing about this is that, again, 95% of the captures that we make are of male bats. So there's something going on here, too, with sexual segregation in this species. So in the process of capturing all these hoary bats, we've also been able to observe some amazing social behaviors with these bats that would kind of belie the notion that these bats could be difficult to capture. So this is a video of a large mist net setup. We've stacked 3 mist nets on top of each other, and right here in the center there's a hoary bat that's been captured in that net. And then we'll see in a second that another bat comes right in on that other bat, followed by a third bat who starts swooping at these bats, and is soon followed by yet a 4th bat. One of them has become entangled in the top of the net up here, and the 4th bat's still swooping around, and a 5th bat starts swooping around on it. Now the 4th bat's captured over here. And then in a second we'll see the 5th bat decides to join in the party. So now we have 5 of these hoary bats in a net. And for some biologists, even bat biologists, they've never seen 5 hoary bats in their entire life, so this is a pretty major event. So clearly I cherry-picked this. This is the best example I have, but I think it gives you an idea that in our area they're not particularly difficult to capture, and perhaps one of the reasons for that is their social interactions. So they're interested in each other, and they're willing to ignore some other cues that normally they would use to avoid these nets. So given that most of the bats that are out there are males, we start to wonder what is motivating these same-sex pursuits. So it seems like folly to think that you could defend a territory. It's wide open spaces and humongous trees. What are they really trying to defend? One of the ideas that we're thinking about is that there's some kind of lekking or territorial behavior going in here. So perhaps the males are trying to come up with some social dominance. So when the rare female does come through, they have the ability to monopolize mating opportunities with that female. It's possible. Another thing that we've considered is, well, maybe these bats, since they're in the act of migrating, maybe these bats are related individuals. So what we tried to do by using a genetic related analysis is we would get the pairs of individuals from the net, and we would then determine what level of genetic relatedness did they have. And it turned out there wasn't much relatedness of the 2 individuals that were in the net at the same time. But as a side finding, we actually found several full siblings, in some cases captured several weeks apart. So this started to raise questions about whether there's a genetic component or a heritable trait about the use of some of these migratory sites. So this is a continuing story we're continuing to work on, but I think there is something to that. There's some heritable components of the migration sites. And finally, there's the so-called homosexual hypothesis. So this was suggested to me by one of our funders. He's actually an emeritus professor of forest genetics from Berkeley. He was out in the field, and I was explaining all this to him, and he says to me, "Have you considered the homosexual hypothesis?" And I just kind of laughed and didn't think about it. And then a couple of years later, I came across this paper about same-sex behavior in bats, which contains a table from, I don't know, a dozen or so species, both in captivity and the wild, where same-sex, so-called homosexual activities have been observed in these bats. So it's something that I guess we can't necessarily rule out. And as fate would have it, the exact same night that the homosexual hypothesis was proposed to me was the first night that we discovered that we could recapture hoary bats. We know that because there's a tissue biopsy hole that we used to obtain the genetic material, and we captured a bat and went to put a new, or take another tissue sample from it and found that we'd already captured it. So up to that point, people would ask, why don't you mock these bats? I think you could learn a lot about their population size or their fidelity to the site. And knowing that there's a solitary tree roosting bat that roams over the entire continent, I thought, it's kind of like picking up that grain of sand you lost at the beach last week. It's nearly impossible. But it turns out that we're actually relatively successful. So after the finding in 2013 that we could recapture bats, we've now switched to pit tags. And our recapture rate within season has been on the rise since then. So it's about 15% of the bats we capture now are recaptures. And part of this has to do with the increasing amount of effort that we've been putting into recapturing bats. So here's where I get into the extreme levels or intense levels of field effort that has to go into this. So this is some photos of the folks that's come out and worked for me. Incredible bunch of people, so enthusiastic. Many of these people are grad students who study different taxonomic groups. They just wanted to kind of get to know bats more often or get to know bats better. And so it's really through the efforts of these folks where we have to go out to recapture bats to really get the incredible data. And so I just want to recognize that and also never neglect the point that even though we're using a lot of high-tech devices that I'll get to here in a second, that we cannot obtain that data without being in the field night after long night to get the data. So in the month of October, we're there 28 days or so. Takes a lot of effort. So just a bit of time after we discovered that we could recapture hoary bats, they developed GPS tags that were small enough to be placed on a bat. So we were hoping to use these tags to study migration. But the first hurdle we found was we were going to need to come up with a way to keep the tags attached to the bats for at least a 6-month period. And we settled, after a number of different thoughts, we settled on suturing the tags to the bats. So we have a veterinarian, Kevin Castle, and he comes out, he sutures the tags in the bats. We've actually been able to recover them to check out their weight and reproductive status afterwards, and they seem to not be really causing undue harm to the bats. We wrote that up in a publication describing the suturing method. So these GPS tags, they're tiny, but it comes with a price. So they log the data, but if you want the data, you have to get the bat back with the tag. If you get the bat back with the tag, then you're actually able to download the data, send it another schedule of fixes, and recharge the battery. So that's great. You can let the bat go again with the tag still attached. But it goes back to that intensive field effort. We need to get the bats back. And did I mention, they take 8 to 10 total fixes. So you tell it a date and time you want to take a fix. It'll take one, and then it goes to sleep until the next time you tell it. So this is a graphic that actually came out of a stable isotope paper by my colleague Paul Cryan and others. And it's trying to describe the potential migratory paths of bats based on stable isotopes. So again, we can see it's a bit of a mess, but there is a trend towards sort of coastal and southward migration. But it makes an important assumption, and that is that bats are traveling in a unidirectional way between their summer habitat and their winter habitat. So we were hoping through the use of these GPS tags to, among other things, to gain some insight into the path that the bats actually take and maybe the habitat features that they're using. So I'm just going to take you through a few little case studies of a few bats and the results that we got from the GPS. So first bat, 481, we attached a tag to it on the 26th of September, recaptured that bat 2 days later in our same field site. It hadn't taken a fix, so we hadn't learned anything about it from the GPS yet. but we released it again. And then 2 days later, we got a GPS location on the bat 50 kilometers away to the southeast. So this was great news to us because we now knew that this technique would actually work. And secondarily, because the fix was taken at night, we knew that it could actually take a fix on a bat while it was flying at night. So that gave us some insight into how we could use these tags in the future. So then 5 days later, we got another fix from that bat. It had moved 18 kilometers in basically the same direction. So we're starting to think, well, now we kind of know the direction that the bats are moving when they leave Humboldt Redwoods. And then perhaps they stop and refuel for several days and then make another jump on their migratory movements. But that would be incorrect because 24 hours after that last fix, it was back in our study area, and we recaptured that same bat. It had flown 68 kilometers in a single night. So now we start to think maybe that wasn't a migratory movement. Maybe that was a pre-migrational movement between its summering area and the general direction it was headed, but we didn't really know which was the summer area and which was the migratory direction. So sort of more questions than answers. So maybe we'll try another bat. So this one captured on the 27th, and again 2 days later recaptured at our site. And then 2 days after that, 25 kilometers away in that same southeast direction. So we start to think we're maybe onto something with this southeast movement. But again, totally wrong. So this bat had gone 335 kilometers. That's about 60 to 70 kilometers per night. And it had traveled to the northeast into Oregon. I don't know. I don't think that's migration. Why is it moving north in October? We're not sure. That maybe wasn't sure either because it headed back into California. This is a week later, and so now we're also seeing that we can get fixes from the bats both in their day roost as well as while they're flying. So this is handy. So the transmitters are very accommodating in that way. We're able to get good location data from them. Let's see, 9 days later, the bat actually went into its third state here. So it went into Nevada, into a desert habitat again, away from trees. It's in a very scrubby area there. Moved back into California, 110-kilometer movement in 4 days. Anyway, by the end of October, it had traveled well over 1,000 kilometers. That's just the straight line distances that we measured. And it ended up, that little dashed line is me. I just wrote that in. It was actually closer to our study area than most of the places that it had been. So it was kind of making this loop throughout all of Northern California. So that's the data. So how to interpret that? What are the implications that we have? This is just a single tag. Maybe this is completely unusual, but the other bat which we got a few days of data with had similar indications. So it did not seem that this was unidirectional movement between summer habitat and wintering habitat. So we started to think what other potential explanations are out there. One is that there's some superabundant prey source that is also migrating at this time of year, and the bat is tracking that. But I think that prey source would have to be incredibly rich to justify a 1,000-kilometer round trip to track them. I think it's more likely that this is part of their complex social and mating behavior. So it could be that for this particular bat, it may have to travel a route like that to find receptive females. Still, it's unknown, but I think it does raise a lot of conservation issues. We hear a lot about migratory corridors and the need for, say, wind energy facilities to avoid migratory corridors. But I would be hard-pressed to define a migratory corridor or really even a prevailing direction for this particular individual. And if this is typical, is it really even possible to kind of characterize what the population of bats is doing, or are we really dealing with a set of unique individuals? That's unclear. It also, of course, raises some methodological issues. So if these kind of movements are typical for this species of bat at other times of year, it really helps us to understand why there's so much slop in the stable isotope analysis, because they weren't in a single location for the summer growing their fur. We've also had the opportunity to use a few of these geolocation data loggers that we got from the Swiss Ornithological Society. So again, taking a page out of the bird migration study. So geolocators are little tags that you put on. It senses the sunlight, and as you change over many degrees of latitude, the time of day that it becomes sunset and sunrise changes over time. And so at coarse levels, bird biologists have been able to infer migration movements of birds. So we're going to try these on hoary bats. But the tags that we got were really great because not only did it include light level measurement, it has an accelerometer, which is a proxy for activity levels, and it also recorded the temperature and pressure of the sense temperature and pressure from above the bat. So we were remarkably, we attached these tags in the same way with sutures. We attached 6 of them, recovered 4, but in 2 cases it had only been 2 and 5 days, so we just let those bats go to try to collect more data and ended up getting data back from 2 individuals. So this is the basic pattern in the data that we get. So the light level is in blue, and the activity levels of the bats are in red. So now we've made this important contribution to science. But seriously, it was really exciting for us to know that that these light level sensors would work on a bat. So we were very concerned that it's roasting in the dense canopy of a redwood forest or deep in a drainage, that it wouldn't sense the light very well. But instead, it sensed the light remarkably well. And I think if the bats were moving hundreds of kilometers away, we would be able to tell that from these light level indicators. So that was really exciting. As I mentioned, so we have this activity information. So activity budgets for bats are very hard-won data for any species of bats. In hoary bats, no one would even think of attempting this. But these activity loggers make it quite simple, and it allows us to evaluate some of the questions that bat biologists ask, such as, well, are bats really only active in the beginning of the night? Are they active all night? Are they active kind of in the evening and then just before dawn? And we can see that for this particular individual, the answer is yes. It just depends on which day it is. There's other factors here, too, I'm not mentioning, but yes. But this is actually the most exciting data. It looks kind of boring, but it's very exciting. So we were able to recover one of these tags in May. So we had an 8-month record of the activity of a single individual hoary bat over the entire winter. So this is unprecedented type of data on a migratory bat. So basically the pattern shows that up until about the 1st of November, the bat's active pretty much every night. Once we get into late April and May, again, it becomes, starts to be active every night. But in between, there's some very long stretches of inactivity in here. So for comparison, I've put up some data here. This is from a little brown bat that's hibernating in a cave in Manitoba. So when bats are hibernating, they do occasionally arouse for a number of reasons, perhaps drinking, perhaps to clear metabolic waste, etc. But the point here is that the pattern that is seen in this hibernating bat isn't very much different from what we saw in this migrating bat. So kind of blurring the lines there between migratory and hibernating bats. And then here's kind of an in-depth view of what was going on with that bat during the month of January. So there's the activities in red. So there's 2 little blips of red here. This is a level of activity that's not really associated with flight. And the other thing that we see was, so basically the bat was inactive throughout the entire month of January. And we see that it was inactive despite the fact that nighttime temperatures were sometimes above 10 degrees Celsius and daytime temperatures were 15 or even 20 degrees Celsius, which is pretty much the exact same temperatures we see bats active during the fall season. So a bit of a mystery. One of the things, and it does start to raise the question of maybe bats are actually hardwired to go inactive during the winter, even though the supposition has been that they're out sort of chasing opportunistically chasing prey throughout the winter. Maybe they're actually hardwired to be closer to a hibernator. One of the things that we didn't know, we can't tell exactly from these tags is where all this inactivity was going on. But on a lark, I decided to download the data from our nearest National Weather Service station, which is about 30 kilometers away, and try to match it to that temperature trace on the bat. And this is, I'm sure, the cleanest relationship that's ever been on my computer screen. So it blew my mind. You can see there's these two blips here where the temperature of the tag was warmer than ambient temperature, and that corresponded exactly to those small bits of activity in the bat. So it's basically, that's the bat rolling over in bed. And then these tags also allow us to evaluate any number of finer grained interactions with weather. So this is what I call my CSI weather relations here. So when I looked at as the bat was coming out of torpor here in early February, I was really intrigued by these couple spots where it wasn't receiving very much light even during the middle of the day. But then we see that the bat moved, reflected here in orange, and it was in an area with a lot more light, moved again, and went back to a spot where there was very little light. So in eastern red bats, they're known in the winter and very cold temperatures to sometimes go and burrow beneath the leaf litter to conserve warmth. So I was thinking, well, maybe something like that was going on with the hoary bat. But now that I had a pretty good idea of where it was, I actually could match it up to the precipitation levels and found that somehow the bat is securing itself in places that are darker during these periods of rain. So this is just one anecdote, one example of what one could do with one of these tags. But I think it really opens up a lot of possibilities for what we can learn about bats, hoary bats right now, but potentially in the future other species of bats, and really begin to understand what powers them through these overwintering periods. Okay, so that's pretty much the whirlwind of what I've been up to over like the last 4 or 5 years. Oh, it's good. And so I'm just going to try to summarize it a little bit. A lot of this stuff is work in progress, so we're just now starting to get some papers out on it, etc. My colleague Jeff Clark calls this the greatest story ever told, which I think means it's like there's a lot of crazy, messy stuff happening in here. It's going to take you a long time to figure out, but that's part of it. So my first thing is that understanding the ecology of bats is really a year-round effort. So until recently, most effort has been focused either in the summer or the winter, and little attention has been paid to how bats move between these places. What about the connectivity between these places? But I think it's very important, and I think we gained some really good insights by learning about that. It's also very difficult. That's why it's taking so long to get some of these results. So we're applying the latest technology. We have to take some risks with that. Most of the transmitters we put out we don't get back, but what we do get back is like gold for us, is what we can see. But right now it really still takes these labor-intensive field efforts to get these tags back and do that. So it's the combination between high-tech and the most brute force method you could imagine is what really has been yielding us results. The other thing I haven't really said anything about is collaboration. I have had the logos of various entities that I've been working with over the years, and I think that's the way these difficult questions can be answered. Reaching out, finding the experts in other fields and trying to work together to solve some of these problems is the way conservation and ecology needs to go these days. In terms of an ecological take-home message, the one that's really kind of popping out at me is that I started this talk by saying there's hibernating bats and there's migrating bats, but I think those lines are really blurred. I think it's more likely that most species of bats in temperate areas use a combination of these strategies, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that they do both of these things. And then finally, these complex social behaviors that I indicated, the chasing behaviors, these long loops throughout Northern California. I think that in terms of trying to understand migratory ecology, the social aspects could actually be more important than things that are conventionally looked at, like roost abundance or prey abundance, things that kind of fit well into quantitative models, but when you see the results of those models, sometimes they might be lacking in predictive ability. And so I think it's really worth us spending time to try to learn the basic stuff. Basic biology, natural history, and behavior is really going to help us to understand the whole picture of what's going on with some of these species. And then I'll just leave you with a couple shots of the awful places we have to work. Thank you. Yeah, hi. So the GPS tags are around $400. Yeah. These Swiss data loggers are actually, well, they're not commercially available. It's sort of, they actually make them in their own lab and for their own uses, and they've been happy to use them with us so they can expand into different taxonomic groups. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the freebase look like on a based on what it is?
I haven't done much to characterize that at all. Actually, one of the students that I'm working with now, she's actually doing a study on winter prey availability that we're going to try to correlate with the activity levels of bats at that beach site there. So she started there out of convenience. That's a difficult one. In the bat literature, they reference the insect literature, which will say that below 10 degrees Celsius there's no say moth activity. But I know that to be untrue because we're out in very low temperatures and seeing what looks to be bat food flying around fairly often. That's a big unknown, and I wish someone would help to study with that. It'd be great. The other thing that I'll mention is that during the fall period, we don't think that the hoary bats are feeding much at all. They seem to be much more interested in their social interactions. Even though it's right before their wintering time and they need to fatten up, the way we know if bats are eating is we capture them and we put them in a little cloth bag and then hold them in there for an hour, and there should be some guano in there. We never find any. Not never. 3% of the time. Yep. Yeah, so with that, we rely on people to assign species assignments on their own. So the idea with it is to try to compile all the data in one place and not worry too much about those specifics, even though those specifics are important. It's a challenge to identify some of the species from their calls. So basically, we say submit the data, and then we have different categories to tell us what you did. Tell us what type of detector you used. Tell us in a categorical terms what process you used to identify the species. So we have the metadata for all of those. So if someone later wanted to go in and said, oh, I don't trust this detector, or I don't trust this way of identifying calls, they could filter them out. But I think at this point it really pays to just compile it all in one place and then look for outliers later. That's right. Yep. I didn't go into the details of how that is, but we can talk about those. Basically, we just want a list of species and night. That's the basic data, and then plus the metadata. Yeah. Yeah, girl.
What are the possibilities of getting a lot of the data that wind energy, private consultants are collecting for wind energy development? There's a ton of data.
Yes, there is, and to tell you the truth, that was my primary motivator in starting this, because going back to some of those spatial models that they had, I was on a webinar where they were presenting this model of interactions between bats and wind energy, and then at the end of it they said, well, it's only this great because we don't have a lot of data, and the webinar was 2 wind energy developers, and I piped in and said, well, actually the people on this call have all the data. It's been a very uphill battle to get them to agree to that. I've gone to the American Wind and Wildlife Association and made a presentation on this to show some of the advantages that there would be even to them. So for instance, with the site in the Mojave Desert, we could show that bat activity was actually higher, and even of migratory bats in downtown LA than it is at their site in the desert. So that would be a good thing. Like, they did their best. But anyway, it's been tough with privacy issues, competition issues, etc. We do have data in there from at least 2 wind energy companies that have been willing to share, at least from some of their sites. So that's helpful because I can use that as ammunition when I talk to other companies. Each of them have their own sort of risk assessments that they do. I personally don't understand them when it comes to acoustic data for bats. But Awesome.
the non-human biologists too.
Yes, that would be great. And I've reached out when I've had the opportunity to folks to ask about that. So the experience, I think, I mean, you might know about it, but the experience is, my experience is that the developers will do what they're told to do in their permit and won't fight it too much. And so if part of the permit says you need to get the data and then turn it over to a repository, they'll just do it. But if they have a choice, then they'll fight it. Yeah.
Well, but for, sorry.
Go ahead.
For acoustic data, at least in Arizona, they probably aren't getting a permit. They're getting a permit for mist netting.
I meant the permit to put the facility in. So usually there's some stipulations. So it's pretty much universally required that before you put in a wind facility that you'll do some acoustic monitoring.
Right.
That's universally in there. But the data goes into reports, and those reports aren't even, you can't even search them on the internet. So I'm willing to go in and take the tables out of a report and type them all in myself to get the data. But you just can't find them. But it's true, what Carol brings up, the wind energy is doing a ton of this, and they're also sampling for bats in places that until wind energy happened, no biologist in their right mind would have ever thought to go look for a bat. So it's actually very valuable in terms of trying to look at migratory movements. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Satellite telemetry, is that to the point where you put it on small critters like that yet, or?
No, I think the smallest satellite transmitter is, I want to say, 18 grams, which is roughly the size of these bats. We're working with one of the largest species of bats too, so even the transmit or the GPSs that we use aren't suitable for all species of bats. Yeah, it's down the road, but in talking to the manufacturer of this, they told me getting something small enough is well down the road. So that's unfortunate. I know, like, and sometime in the future we'll look back and say, oh, I can't believe we actually had to go out and try to get that same exact bat back. That's ridiculous. But yeah.
Any more questions? Well, if you have any more, you can join us in a discussion group in about 10 minutes. Room 34A. Okay. And also at 6:30 we're having dinner at a historic.